When historians describe the year 1901 in Jacksonville, Florida, they usually focus on the devastation above ground. The Great Fire that consumed 146 city blocks, the 10,000 left homeless, the 2,368 buildings reduced to ash in just 8 hours. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers, the one that even today sits buried in archival footnotes, began below the surface. It started with a simple rebuilding order. Engineers were instructed to clear debris across the burnt district, stabilize foundations, and determine whether the ground could support a new city rising from the ashes. The goal was practical: remove the wreckage, inspect the soil, and prepare for reconstruction. But the moment workers began digging through the charred remains, something unexpected happened. They broke through a layer that hadn't been exposed in living memory. Beneath the basement floors, deeper than any known construction reached, the crews found chambers and passages that didn't match any building records. Their design was unusual, their scale was massive, and the construction didn't resemble anything in the architectural catalogues of turn-of-the-century Florida. It didn't even resemble Spanish colonial building methods. As commonly understood, this wasn't mentioned in the public reports about reconstruction. It didn't make it into the newspapers celebrating Jacksonville's phoenix-like rebirth. But in the internal notes of that year, a quiet phrase appears over and over again. Unforeseen structures, unexpected depth, origin unknown. The official story would later simplify all of this into old merchant cellars, abandoned storage facilities, or simply misidentified storm drains. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the recovery photographs from the time, the ones developed in dim offices while Jacksonville rebuilt itself at record speed, show something different. They show workers standing beside brick archways cut with precision far cleaner than any mason of the era should allow. Passages fitted together so carefully that even in the poor lighting of 1901 photography, the engineering is undeniable. Corridors and tunnel systems that don't resemble any known American construction, but something older, more systematic, more deliberate. And the deeper they dug, the more the layers stopped looking like urban history as we know it, and more like infrastructure that had been buried, hidden, and deliberately forgotten. At first, the recovery teams tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible. Old basements, forgotten utility tunnels, natural sinkholes, common to Florida geology. But as notes accumulated and more structures were uncovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the subterranean buildings constructed with load-bearing capabilities far exceeding anything that stood above them? Why were certain brick patterns formed in modular arrangements, as if mass-produced rather than hand-laid? Why did some passages extend into darkness far beyond the footprint of any documented neighborhood? And the question that troubled even the most experienced engineers, why were these underground structures so vast? Jacksonville in 1901 was a growing port city, yet the infrastructure beneath parts of the burnt district appeared built for a population far larger than anything the city had ever recorded. Recovery teams quietly admitted among themselves that the extent and sophistication didn't line up with any known development phase. And although none of them were using terms like buried civilization, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built extensively on this ground before. Not simple cellars, not storage rooms, an entire subterranean district. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports became shorter. Descriptions became vague, photographs stopped showing the widest views of the discoveries. And then the excavation zones were partially filled again in late 1901, covered where needed for new foundations, and much of what was exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments remain, notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of archivists who saw the files before some of them disappeared. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible. Structures too extensive for any documented Jacksonville development, masonry too precise for the accepted timeline, construction methods that look inherited rather than improvised, architecture that seems to belong to a different era of building entirely. When the recovery teams moved past the first recognizable layers beneath the burnt district, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find basement level, perhaps some old cisterns and scattered remnants from pre-fire construction. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within weeks that assumption collapsed because instead of a neat sequence of building phases, the teams uncovered a stack of architectural layers that didn't behave the way infrastructure of a normal city is supposed to behave. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These mysteries don't fit neatly into official history, and uncovering them requires looking where conventional narratives refuse to go. The first anomaly was orientation. Each layer, documented buildings, unknown sub-basements, and whatever lay beneath, seemed to follow the same directional grid, the same street alignments, the same urban planning logic. Different eras shouldn't do that. Different builders, different decades, different purposes. They don't build in perfect alignment with structures that came generations before. Yet beneath Jacksonville, they did. Corridors from one era connected directly to passages buried meters below them. Structural walls maintained the same bearing even when separated by what appeared to be decades of sediment. It was as if every group that ever built on this ground was following an original street plan, one that no longer existed in any city records. As the workers dug deeper, the layers became stranger. Beneath the expected foundation and clay, they began encountering brickwork that looked nothing like contemporary construction. Much larger units, much tighter mortar joints, patterns that seemed too mathematically precise for anything in Jacksonville's documented timeline. Some archways appeared almost over-engineered, curved passages with flawless geometry, crafted with precision that didn't match the crude kilns of frontier Florida. The brick itself raised questions. Chemical analysis conducted years later on salvage samples showed firing temperatures higher than any known kiln in the region could achieve. Compositions that didn't match local clay deposits. Bonding techniques that resembled industrial manufacturing more than hand-formed masonry. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the Geological Survey team. Water-damaged foundations, brick surfaces eroded as if exposed to flowing water for extended periods, lower passages with flood marks, walls with mineral deposits that only form after prolonged submersion. Yet there is no historical record of Jacksonville experiencing flooding at these depths in recent centuries. No maps showing underground streams beneath these specific locations. Nothing that explains why large sections of the deepest structures look like they had once been completely submerged or buried beneath layers of waterlogged sediment for decades, possibly longer. Recovery photographs taken in 1901 show this clearly. Workers standing beside archways so massive that the men look miniature in comparison. Brickwork laid so precisely that even today masons study the archival images in disbelief. Angles and curves that resemble engineering far more sophisticated than anything turn-of-the-century Florida is credited with. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports written in the months after the fire barely mention these features. Some drawings omit the deepest levels entirely. Certain structures are summarized with vague terms like old construction or previous development, even though the photographs show they were far more complex than that. The silence is hard to miss, because if these deeper layers truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual construction methods documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across private collections instead of gathered into a single municipal report? Even some of the masonry raised red flags, edges too sharp, surfaces too smooth, drainage systems too sophisticated. Marks that look less like hand tools and more like precision cutting. Cutting that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those structures were supposedly built. What the recovery teams uncovered were structures that didn't match Spanish colonial construction, didn't match American frontier building, and didn't even match each other in any conventional sense. Instead, they formed a strange architectural vocabulary, one that seemed to come from multiple periods yet somehow remained unified, aligned, and impossibly systematic. The underground street grid. The first shock came with the scale itself. These weren't isolated cellars or scattered storage rooms. They were an organized network, a complete underground district with what appeared to be streets, intersections, and building foundations laid out in a coherent grid pattern. Some passages were wide enough for wagons, others contained what appeared to be sidewalk remnants, raised sections along the walls that suggested pedestrian walkways. The layout wasn't random, it was planned, designed, executed with the kind of urban organization that Jacksonville's surface streets wouldn't achieve until decades later. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today, the elaborate ventilation systems. Officially, they were later labelled as storm drains or natural air pockets, but nothing about them fits typical drainage or geological formations. These were engineered shafts, vertical passages with brick-lined walls positioned at regular intervals throughout the underground network. Some contained remnants of what appeared to be mechanical louvers or adjustable covers. Others showed signs of deliberate air circulation design, with angled channels that would have created natural updrafts. Workers from 1901 described them in private letters as breathing holes, not drains but ventilation for occupied spaces, though no official history acknowledges Jacksonville ever having a functioning underground district. Another anomaly appeared in the foundation system itself. Throughout the underground network, workers found massive support columns, brick pillars far more substantial than anything needed to support the wooden buildings that had stood above. These weren't holding up warehouses or shops. They were engineered to bear enormous distributed loads, as if the entire surface level was meant to be substantially heavier. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The Jacksonville that burned in 1901 may not have been the first city on this site. It may have been built on top of something much larger, a development whose scale was never recorded, never taught, and never explained in Florida's official history. The deeper the workers dug, the more impossible it became to dismiss these findings as isolated anomalies. What emerged was evidence of systematic urban planning, a complete underground infrastructure that extended beneath at least 17 city blocks, possibly more. Here's where the story gets truly bizarre. In the weeks following the fire, recovery supervisors documented over 1,700 distinct subterranean structures within the excavation zone. Not rooms within buildings, distinct structures, each with its own foundation, walls, and apparent purpose. That number appeared in preliminary reports, but within months it vanished from official records. Later documents reference only various sub-basements or old construction. The specific count of 1,700 structures disappeared, almost as if someone decided that number raised too many uncomfortable questions. Because if Jacksonville truly had 1,700 underground buildings, where did the population go? Why was this district abandoned? And most importantly, why does no historical record acknowledge its existence? As documentation accumulated, another pattern emerged. Despite the apparent age differences between layers, all the structures shared certain characteristics. Standard brick sizes, consistent archway dimensions, uniform ceiling heights. It suggested centralized planning, institutional standards, and coordinated construction across the entire network. This wasn't organic urban growth. It was designed possibly by a single administrative authority with the resources to enforce building codes across a massive project. The physical artifacts recovered from the underground network only deepened the mystery. Workers found manufactured items that didn't match any known Jacksonville businesses. Ceramic pipes with maker's marks from companies that don't appear in any registry. Metal fixtures using alloy compositions that weren't commercially available in Florida. glass panes with manufacturing techniques that regional historians can't identify. Some objects appeared deliberately placed as if the spaces were evacuated in an orderly manner. Others seemed abandoned suddenly, left behind when the underground district was permanently closed. Perhaps most disturbing were the markings found on certain walls. Not graffiti, not casual scratches, but carefully carved symbols, and what appeared to be way-finding signs in a language or notation system that doesn't match any known script used in Florida's history. Some researchers later claimed these were just decorative elements or contractor marks, but their consistent placement at intersections and major passages suggests functionality, a navigation system for an underground district extensive enough to require one. When you study the final weeks of the 1901 recovery operation, something becomes impossible to ignore. The project didn't end. It was stopped. Not completed, not concluded, stopped. The deeper the recovery teams went, the more the tone of their notes changed. Early entries were detailed, almost excited by the archaeological significance. But by autumn 1901, the language becomes guarded, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be documented. And this is where the final mystery begins, because the most extensive chambers, the most sophisticated structures, the most intact sections of the underground network, these were the areas that were reburied first. Workers described filling entire passages back in, collapsing entrances, pouring thousands of cubic yards of fill into spaces that had just been uncovered. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation: structural concerns, safety requirements, construction schedules. But if it was only about safety, why were the most structurally sound sections, the ones with perfect brickwork and intact arches, the first to be buried? And why were obviously damaged areas sometimes left partially exposed? It doesn't make sense unless those deeper discoveries posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, a historical one. Perhaps most telling is what happened to Jacksonville's municipal maps. Pre-fire surveys from the 1890s show certain areas marked with notations like basement district or lower development. Post-fire maps from 1902 onwards show the same locations with no such markings. The underground network simply vanished from official cartography. Even property records changed. Deeds that once referenced lower levels or subterranean access were rewritten during reconstruction to eliminate these mentions. It was as if the city made a collective decision to pretend the underground structures never existed. Why was the deepest evidence, the most extensive infrastructure, the most sophisticated engineering sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The organized street grid was buried, the ventilation systems were buried, the 1,700 distinct structures were buried, the uniform construction standards were buried, the unidentifiable inscriptions were buried, and even parts of the photographic record vanished, almost as if the recovery operation had accidentally revealed a chapter of Jacksonville's history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than Spanish colonization, older than the city we know, older than the narrative we were given. The 1901 Jacksonville excavation wasn't just a fire recovery operation. It was a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse into a version of the city's past that raises more questions than answers. Because if Jacksonville stands on top of an entire buried district built by a population we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1901. It's what else lies beneath American cities. What other fires? What other convenient disasters cleared the surface just long enough for someone to bury what was below? And why does a city need to forget 1,700 buildings? The answer might be simpler and more disturbing than any elaborate theory, because acknowledging them would require rewriting everything we think we know about who built America and when, and what came before. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.